true crime fans. I'm your host, Heather.
And I'm Danielle.
And you're listening to part 2 of the murder of Dereck Michael Brock. If you haven't had the chance to listen to part 1, I would suggest going back and listening to that episode first so you can really get an understanding for who Mike was and just how everything began to unfold in this incredibly horrific crime. So just to recap a little bit, in part 1, we heard some pretty insane clips from both Cynthia Wilkins' interrogation as well as Charles Gable, the man who admitted to dismembering and disposing of Mike Brock's body. We also spoke with Mike's ex-wife, Betty Belcher, and we'll hear more from Betty in this episode as well as clips from more interrogation tapes. Cynthia Wilkinson took investigators in a lot of different directions, changing her story multiple times, and each story was a bigger lie than the last before finally admitting to killing Mike.
Well, and that's what it seems like. That I think that's an understatement of how many different clips or just kind of how morbid this crime is. That we learned from part 1, that there was so many ins and outs and so many people involved. And it really just kind of left me questioning, honestly, so much. One big thing that stood out to me is that, and I know that this sounds bad, but I just don't quite understand how his family didn't talk to him for that many years. That I know that they had a fight, and Betty had mentioned, that this is just something that happens sometimes. But to the extent that they wouldn't know for that many years, 2016 to 2021, that he had died.
No, he lived halfway across the country, and I think it's very important for listeners to understand that they had a fight, and they went a good while without speaking, and that wasn't something out of the ordinary. And I know firsthand what that's like. I too have had fights with my dad, and I went an entire year without speaking to him. And it's terrible, but it happens. And when Gail was trying to reach out to him, Cynthia was using Mike's phone. Between Cynthia texting with Mike's phone and texting Gail back, responding to all those text messages and everything, that whole time Gail thought that was her dad responding. And then you have Cynthia speaking to Kathleen, who was Mike's aunt, and everyone's listening to her, and she's telling the family that she spoke to Mike, but she didn't technically speak to Mike. She spoke to Cynthia, who was assuring her that Mike was okay. And so between those two things, they didn't really have any reason to believe that Mike was in any danger, much less deceased.
Well, and you bring up a good point, too, that, just even with my parents down the street, I wish that they would text more than actually talking to them on the phone. And in this age of technology, that makes it so much easier. So honestly, I couldn't say that if I felt like that I was in some kind of communication with them, probably at that point, if they were texting regularly like that, I would have already thought that everything blew over. So that's what makes this so much more bizarre or, horrific to me, honestly, because it's like Cynthia was keeping up the lie, and it's just sad that this all had to happen.
It is incredibly sad. And after talking with Betty, my heart just absolutely broke talking to her. And she goes on to tell quite a bit more in part 2. So without further ado, let's jump right into part 2 on the murder of Dereck Michael Brock. Investigators believe Mike Brock was killed on April 21st, 2016 by Cynthia Wilkinson. They believe after killing Brock in his home, she kept his body in a car she had parked at a friend's house in southern Colorado for several months before asking Charles Gable to help her dismember and dispose of the body in late 2016 or early 2017. Wilkinson had kept the secret that Mike was killed for almost 6 years, making it appear to family and friends that he was still alive. The details of what Charles Gable and Cynthia Wilkinson did to Mike's body are graphic and incredibly hard to hear, so listener discretion is advised.
Will killed Mike, and Will did this, and Will did that, but there was no evidence to point to Will Johnson. She took his body from the house, left it in his little Subaru car on her friend's property where it rotted. Then she came back and got it and buried the body and dumped lime on it in a field. And then a sign went up about a construction going to be starting in that area. She went back and got the body, put it in the back of her truck, called Charles Gable to see where he was, and he was at a storage unit in Colorado. She drove to the storage unit and met Charles Gable with the rotting body in the back of her truck, and she asked him to help her. He went back to Red Feathers Lake to Mike's house with her, and they put the body in trash bags and put it in Mike's freezer. And then after a period of time, they took the body back out of the freezer and used a chainsaw and cut it up into small enough pieces to where Charles could put it in a cooker, a big pan, and cook it on a gas cooker in acid until it dissolved. And what didn't dissolve, the bones that didn't dissolve, Charles crushed them up and put them back in the acid until there was nothing left and poured it down the drain on the property. And so that's the reason why there was nothing. Cynthia gave several statements about her thinking the body was buried in the backyard and she didn't know where the body was and she doesn't know anything about it.
Here is a clip from Cynthia Wilkinson's interrogation.
How was he cut up?
I didn't know he was getting cut up until they showed me a video of Charlie saying that. Honest to God, I didn't know that. But Charlie said I dismembered him.
But Charlie also told you how he got rid of him.
No, he didn't. He just said it's
He
done.
said he helped you get rid of him.
He helped me by taking him out of the freezer, and I thought burying him back there.
Charlie says you were involved in his dismemberment and you were involved in his burial. So what did they tell you Charlie said about that cooker?
They just asked me where it was, and then they said, well, Charlie said that you dismembered it, or you helped him dismember the body, and he was putting the body in that cooker and cooking it down so that he could bury it. And I said,
bury it?
No, I said bury it. He said, well, he disposed of it. He poured it out.
Here is a snippet from investigators' interview with Charles Gable.
So when you went to the Home Depot, what did you exactly purchase at Home Depot?
5 or 6 buckets of 5-gallon buckets with lids and some muriatic acid.
And how did you pay for that?
All cash. I don't have credit cards or anything like that.
Okay. And then so after you bought the stuff in Denver, what happened then?
Well, we took off. I met her up there. I went up there. I've been up there a couple times.
So you went back to the cabin?
We went back to the cabin, and we took him out of the thing, and we chopped it up. Like you said, it didn't even look human. I mean, that part, like it was just.
So you had to unseal the buckets?
We unsealed the buckets, but we took them out of the freezer, and we pulled the bags off, and it was wrapped in a blanket. And that's when I noticed it was duct taped and blindfolded.
And what was the color of the duct tape again?
Yellow.
And blindfolded with what?
A rag, but it didn't even look like anything. You couldn't. I mean, you could see a kind of a pattern on the blanket, but it was such a. It was so matted and like there was so much dirt in it. There was a bunch of rock in it, and
it was already. He was already. We'll just stop calling it it because it was a human being.
Yes, sir.
So he was already in 3 pieces.
Yes.
So do you believe that Cythina had help killing Mike?
No, I think she did it herself. One of her stories was that her and Will Johnson held Mike down and injected him with heroin. And then her other story is that she poisoned him. I believe she poisoned Mike with something in his food or in his drink, and I believe she did it all on her own. Mike was a small frame man. Cythina is a pretty big woman, pretty tall in stature, pretty big bone. Given enough time, she could have accomplished everything that she did. The getting the body in the car, letting it rot, getting it out of the car and burying it. When you look in the eyes of this woman like I did in the courtroom, and when you're in the presence of pure evil, you know right then at that moment that that woman is capable of anything.
After changing her story numerous times and even claiming that a man by the name of Will Johnson had actually been the one to murder Mike, Cythina finally admitted to poisoning him so she could take ownership of his property in Red Feather Lakes as well as his vehicles.
So tell me what happened. You drove Will up there.
Mm-hmm.
And then you drove him back.
Yes.
What y'all talk about on the way back?
That's what I just told him. It was the longest drive in my life. Nothing. When he come in and just said, "You will not say a word of this to anybody," I was scared to death if I said anything that he would think that I was just going to call the authorities or something, and I was afraid I wouldn't make it home. So we didn't talk about anything.
How long after y'all got there was it before y'all made the trip back down? How long were you at the house, probably, with Will?
After we come back down?
How long were you at the house with Will
when he put the Mike in the body in the freezer?
Yes, ma'am.
As soon as he come back in the house, and remember I told you I was in the refrigerator, or slid down in front of the refrigerator?
Mm-hmm.
That's when he come in the house and kicked me and said, "You're not going to say a word of this to anybody, are you?" And I said, "No." And he reached down and grabbed my arm and pulled it. He said, "Let's get out of here."
We've known from the beginning, when we started this case, that Mike was dead.
Right.
And we have dug up all the paperwork that comes back to you.
Now the family is left fighting to get the property back that was fraudulently sold by Wilkinson, and this has been no easy task for them.
So she killed Mike, and then she basically took all of his assets. She forged her way through getting the deed to his house turned over. And while I was researching this case, I saw something when she went in to do what I believe was called the quitclaim deed.
Yes.
She had brought someone with her posing as Mike. Do I have that right?
Yes, she did. She went to a notary's home. And we're unsure about the notary, whether or not there's a connection there. I've hired a private investigator to look into that. She went to Sandra Maldonado's home and supposedly had these witnesses and had Mike there to sign the deed, giving away his home on a mountaintop to a woman for $0. And this notary did not take copies of anybody's ID, which she should have done. She didn't get down any information off of anyone's ID that was supposed witness. And when the Larimer County Sheriff's Department asked her about that, and when they showed her the picture of Mike Brock and asked her if she had ever seen this man before, she said no. And they said, well, this is Mike Brock, and he was dead. You know, my daughter and I have had lengthy conversations about this, and I'm going to pursue this, and everyone that was involved, the county officials that filed this quitclaim deed without any question or anything, when the names were wrong on the quitclaim deed, where it says Dereck Michael Brock, in some areas it says Dereck Michael Brook. It was filed before it was prepared. The dates are off.
Wilkinson had forged a quitclaim deed, which is basically a deed to quickly transfer a property in someone else's name. And it's typically used when family members transfer property between each other. She forged this deed transferring ownership of Mike's home from him to her and her husband, Jesse, approximately 1 month after murdering him. Cythina had misspelled Mike's name 3 times on the documents, writing Brooke instead of Brock.
I'm going to do everything that I can until the day I die to bring everyone to justice. No matter how small of a part they had in this, I'm going to do everything I can to punish everyone that was involved in it, because so many balls were dropped with the Larimer County Sheriff's Department, with the county taking this deed at face value, with the notary not getting anything to prove who these people were. Charles Gable was interviewed, and he asked for nothing. He was in prison when they went to prison to interview him. He tells them in his interrogation, I told my parole officer, you can go to my parole officer, and my parole officer will tell you what I told them when I helped dismember the body, when we did this to the body. All of this heartache and all of this financial burden that we are having right now trying to get the house back could have been prevented. Charles Gable told everything in detail of what he did.
Do you know what the time frame was? How much time went by between the time that he had mentioned to his parole officer what he did and the time that officers actually took him seriously and investigated that? Do you have a time frame?
It was a couple of years. Charles Gable said, I was high on drugs at the time. It's no excuse. But Charles Gable says Cythina is an evil woman. Now, this is coming from a man that did what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And he's calling her an evil person.
As for Cythina, investigators believe this wasn't her first rodeo, and that there could quite potentially be others who have been in contact with her whose deaths she may be responsible for.
Because this isn't Cynthia's first murder. Everybody that Cythina has had a relationship or been married to is dead. That came from the officer's mouth. Tyler Thomas said that everybody she's been involved with is dead. And people she's dated is dead. Cythina wrote in her journal the exact day that Mike died. She made a notation in her journal. She wrote in her journal about retitling the vehicles. She wrote in her journal about people coming up to do the project. And the project was to dismember Mike's body and to clean up the garage and clean up the blood splatter. That's what that's about. But Cynthia's sister, Paulette, said that she got a phone call from Cythina back, I guess a couple years ago. It could have been before or after Mike's murder. Cythina asked her sister to go to a whole other state to a funeral of a man that she had dated that was dead. She wanted her sister to go to the funeral and take a picture of him in the casket. And her sister did. just that. Desiree talks in her interrogation that she is talking to her mother on the phone, and she is taking care of Jesse's mother and father. And Jesse's father is in bed. Cythina takes a picture of Jesse's father in the bed and sends it to Desiree. And Desiree said she called her mom and said, "Mom, he looks like he's dead. Call 911. So, I mean, it just isn't Mike. It's other people. When we left Colorado in February, the DA said that the DA in Pueblo, I believe, was exhuming Jesse's father's body because they believed he had been poisoned with antifreeze.
And you mentioned that Jesse's mother had become ill also. Did she end up passing, or did they confirm?
No, she didn't pass, but she told Gail, my daughter talked to her, she told Gail that she had mercury poisoning and that she believed Cythina was trying to kill her. Cythina was living there at that place with Jesse's mother when the police started tailing her and investigating her. Had she been given enough more time, I believe Jesse's mother would be dead. Jesse's mother, I think, went on vacation or somewhere to get away from her for a period of time. And then all the chips just started falling into place, and Cythina ended up being arrested. And Cythina called Jesse's mom and said, "Can you get rid of the chainsaw?" And Jesse's mom said, "It's too late. The police are here and they have it." As soon as we found out what had happened, and I said, "Well, what about Mike's house? And what about Mike's vehicles? And what about everything?" I immediately contacted an attorney and let the attorney know what happened and that she had stolen the house. She had did a quick claim deed. She had now sold the house, and the house had been sold to another family. They were in it. What can we do? So that's where we are now with that. We are in a battle to get the house back. The people that bought the house bought title insurance, which would cover them in the event of whatever happening, fraud or whatever happening with the actual sale of the home. The title insurance would make the new buyers whole. And Gail and Jessica would have gotten the home back since it was their father's asset.
The lender, Arkansas-based Bank of England, who holds the mortgage, has offered a pretty petty little settlement agreement to Gail Brock in the amount of only $115,000, which is actually more than the original pathetic amount they tried to offer her of a lousy $15,000, determined through mediation. So they basically tried to pay the family off just to walk away and forget this fraudulent act ever happened.
But the title insurance and the Bank of England hired an attorney to fight Gail and Jessica in getting the home back. They don't want to make good on their insurance. They want to give Gail and Jessica $115,000 for them to shut up and go away. They want Gail and Jessica to sign a document to say that, yes, indeed, Mike did give his home to his murderer, and this will never happen. Gail said, "This will never happen. I'll die first before I sign anything that says my father gave the home to the woman that murdered him and dismembered his body."
The people that bought the house, they're really trying to fight having to leave their house.
Yes, they don't care, and we set up a GoFundMe page to try and get some support, tried to get the story out. We did a story with the local news. It never really went anywhere because we're so small here where we are. and, to try and raise money on the GoFundMe to help with the legal fees, because we've had to get loans to hire an attorney to fight this in court. And it's set to go to trial in February of next year to fight to get the house back that was stolen from the woman that murdered him. Sold the house, and they know the quitclaim deed is a forgery. But we've still got to go to court to fight and get this back. There's so many details of this case of what actually happened to Mike's body that I don't ever want my daughter to know. I didn't even want her to know what she already knows, because it's so bad that you can't ever get it out of your mind. You think about it every day, and you think about his last moments. My daughter doesn't know his last moments, but I do. And I had prayed so hard that Mike didn't know what was about to happen to him. But given the condition of the body and what Charles Gable said, I know Mike knew he was going to be murdered. That was it for him. And my only hope is that he prayed within himself to God before he left this world. But he knew what was about to happen to him, because he had been tied up. His hands had been taped in front of his body, and he had a blindfold on. So he knew he was going to die. And I don't ever want my daughter to know that.
On February 1st, 2022, she pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to the maximum 30 years in prison. Charles Gable was given an immunity deal for his help in testifying against Wilkinson, and therefore he was not charged.
So, wow. That was a lot. And honestly, part 2 seemed to have a lot more graphic clips of that interrogation that I don't know exactly if I was ready for. But in that, I guess what I started thinking about was there's so many people that are entangled in this, that when I first listened to part 1, I thought that we would be talking about something pretty basic, that Cythina killed Mike, and then to go from there. But then we start talking about all these other people, such as Charles. Is it Charles Wilkerson?
Gable. Charles Gable.
Okay, got it. Charles Gable. Then Jesse. Then Willie Johnson, which I am a little confused how he plays into that. It sounds like they cleared him of any doing. Is that correct?
So Cynthia, she took investigators on a lot of different paths, and her ultimate goal was trying to take them on any and every path that was not leading towards her. And so she talked about a man by the name of Will Johnson. And what our listeners did not hear, because the interrogation tapes were extremely lengthy, and I didn't want to flood the episode with nonstop interrogation, but she tried to say that a man by the name of Will Johnson had wanted to buy pot that Mike was allegedly growing in his basement. And her first story, I believe, was that she went to see Mike and she brought Will Johnson with her, and they walked in the house, and Mike had he had hurt his back. This is all according to Cynthia. And they found him in bed, dead, and a whole lot of empty pill bottles were on the floor beside him. So I think she was trying to go in the direction of maybe he overdosed on meds. And then I believe she changed that story, and then she started blaming Will for being the one that killed Mike. And so I asked Betty if Will had any part in it, if he was being charged with anything. Betty, number one, doesn't believe that Cythina had any help in killing Mike.
Not even Charles?
Well, no, not in the actual murder. Now, Charles did admit to helping her dismember Mike, but in the actual killing, Betty believes that it was strictly the doing of Cythina. So she's trying to get the heat off of her. So there was ultimately no evidence that investigators could find linking Will Johnson to any of this. So he was not charged.
Well, I feel like that we mentioned him a lot in part 1, but then part 2, I guess I just didn't feel like those loose ends were tied. So, I mean, thanks for tying that up. I guess something I noticed too, I mean, as you're talking, yes, anybody that committed a murder, right, they're going to try to get the heat off of them. But then how quickly all these people were coming out, like Jessie, that was saying that she admitted to him several times that she had killed Mike and that he started to worry about his own parents. She was living with them. That he confesses, Charles Gable confesses as well. And I mean, it kind of all points to Cythina. And I thought her responses to the interrogation were interesting. I guess, and I don't know for sure what I was expecting. I thought that we would get a little more emotion from her. What do you think?
I think she was totally disconnected from all of it. And I noticed a lot in the long interrogation that I had listened to before even making the episode, that she was trying to create little jokes or moments where she would make light of the fact that she is being interrogated for a gruesome murder. And in my opinion, that's the work of a psychopath.
Well, absolutely. That, I mean, to totally disconnect like that. I mean, she says in the interrogation that she didn't know that Charles Gable was going to dismember or put acid, or what was it, lime and basically cook up the body parts like that. No way. She knew that, and I honestly think that she probably orchestrated that.
According to Charles Gable, she paid him to do this, and he claims that she was very much involved in the dismemberment, but she makes it sound like she had no idea that he was going to be dismembered. She also had mentioned in the lengthy interrogation that when she claimed to have found Mike dead in his bed, her first reaction was to call 911. And that Will Johnson, who she later said murdered him, advised her it wasn't a good idea because the entire house reeked of pot, and they both were just released from prison. I know Cythina, I don't know how long she had been out of prison, but she had just been released, and she claimed that Will Johnson told her she's going to go back to prison. But if you catch the fact that she claims to investigators that she wanted to call 911, you know, she's trying to make herself seem really innocent in this whole thing. And she's far, far, far away from innocent. And actually, Charles Gable, who did what he did, and what he did was evil in itself, but he had mentioned in the lengthy interview that, or interrogation, that she's evil. She's a crazy woman.
Well, exactly. And yes, he did what he did. And I would be interested, and maybe I missed it, that even in the long interrogation, did they say how much he got paid for that?
I'm wanting to say that I heard somewhere in the, like I said, it was a very lengthy interrogation, somewhere around $10,000. And he was high on drugs. I don't know if he was doing it because he needed more drugs or what the situation was. She had swindled a lot of money from Mike's family, in particular Kathleen. And that, if you'll recall, is Mike's aunt, and she was 90 years old. She suffered from dementia, and Cythina befriended Kathleen and managed to get a large sum. Like I'm talking like $1 million swindled out of Kathleen. So my guess is if this wasn't her first rodeo, which it seems like investigators are pretty certain that it wasn't, then this, I would think, is her ammo. This is her motive for anyone she may have killed.
So I think that I can speak for the audience when I say $10,000. You did all of that for $10,000. That's insane.
It's insane, but when you think about it, if he claimed that he was high on drugs, and so far I don't think he's misled investigators. Like, he's not gaining anything from this confession. So I think if you're on drugs and you have no drugs, I think he would have done this for $10.
No, and it's so true, and honestly sad that someone would subject themselves to that just for that next high, even if it's $10,000. I mean, sitting there listening to them go into detail of cooking up the body, with acid and making sure that there was nothing left, that to do all of that for just $10,000 as a sober person, we think that's crazy. But as you bring up, I mean, someone that's just looking for the next high.
Like I said, there was a lot of pieces to this case, but I'm pretty certain that that's what he was offered. But like I said, when you're on drugs, it doesn't even matter. And he is, for what it's worth, and I don't know if it's really worth anything, to be quite honest, not in my opinion, but for what it's worth, Charles Gable confessed because he said this was weighing on his chest for quite some time, and he did mention in one of the lengthier interrogations that he regrets what he did, but he did what he did, and that was something incredibly major. Saying I'm sorry for what I did. You say I'm sorry for things like stepping on someone's toe or cutting in front of them in line. Saying I'm sorry for dismembering a human being? No.
Yeah, sorry to Betty and to Gail. That's not going to cut it. But something that he is doing that will help is coming clean about what happened, and that gives investigators, that gave the investigators what they needed to get Cythina.
Well, that's true, and I hope that it does bring a little bit more peace to the family. I can't imagine what they're going through, and it was heartbreaking talking to Betty and hearing the pain in her voice as she told the story, and what her daughter, Mike's other daughter, Jessica, is from a previous relationship. But these poor girls, I can't imagine the pain they are going through and not having a burial site, or, they can't even bury their father. It's heart-wrenching.
It really is. I mean, never mind that really, yes, the last conversation was a fight. And then for, I'm sure, the daughters thinking that things were blowing over because they were texting back and forth and that line of communication was coming to again. And that really just brings where, honestly, it's cases like this that make me want to make sure I am talking to my parents on the phone, that I know that it's them, because crazy things happen like this.
Absolutely.
I think something that we need to bring up as well is kind of the county and the quick deed. I feel like this company, all the ins and outs, the county itself really dropped the ball. And as I was listening to part 1 and part 2, I was just constantly reminded of that they didn't double check to make sure that it was Mike that was signing, or that he was even present, or his ID. And I was just amazed by that. But in the same sense, I honestly think that happens more than you know. And it's scary that it can turn into this. When this happens, in other small towns or whatever, it doesn't seem this bad because it's not someone on the other end trying to totally murder a person. But I really feel like that this is a wake-up call too, of that they're not double checking. I think this is not an isolated incident, that counties all over the place, companies all over the place are not doing their due diligence, and this proves that. That's where I think you see that they're trying to pay off the girls, because they know they messed up.
They know they messed up, and it's an insult. The little amount that they were trying to pay the daughters in order just to shut up and go away. It's insulting. They first offered them $15,000, and then I believe they upped that to $115,000, which was still a huge insult. It's sick that they would, it was fraud. And like Betty Belcher said in the interview, it was fraud, and they are still having to take this to court to fight for what is rightfully theirs.
Well, and that's what makes it hard to believe. I mean, they know they messed up. So $15,000 is just insane and an insult. They're getting a little closer with the $115,000, but in the same sense that this was their dad. And now, granted, nope, he was already dead. However, if they would have did their due diligence, everything would have came to light a lot quicker. That they would have actually been able to salvage some of the property or the real estate that's rightfully theirs. And now it's having to go to court. You have new owners that are there that they don't want to leave. I doubt that they know exactly what happened. But also, okay, real estate in Colorado is hard to come by. So I'm not surprised that the new owners don't want to sell. If you told me what had happened there and this whole situation, then yes, that, I mean, a lot of people that you'd want to help out. But
the fact that the new owners are fighting them so hard, I don't think that's right. I don't think it's right that they would fight them at all. I understand that they thought they were buying this house fair and square, and they had no idea that there was any kind of fraud, but now they do. Not only do they know that there's fraud involved, they know the horror that took place at the house that they ended up buying.
Well, I definitely agree. Something I thought, from part 2 that I thought was kind of interesting. Betty mentioned that they have title insurance, which, and maybe I'm misinformed, but usually that's like an extra expense to my understanding. Like, you have some kind of guarantee when you buy the house, but to have additional title insurance, how would they have known that? They would have needed that. I guess that's the question that was brought up to me. I also wondered, okay, we said Cynthia, sold the house and had sold it pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, I believe she sold it pretty quickly, which, again, I'm sure real estate in Colorado, especially this house, didn't take long to sell.
Yeah, I don't think so. But I'm wondering if she's trying to kind of double her tracks. I wonder what the possibility is if she produced her own buyers, that if she knows these people.
I think at this point anything is possible, really.
Well, it just got me thinking, because how would they know to get title insurance, which is true that they would totally be reimbursed for any kind of wrongdoing. That's all the more reason that this is messed up, is they'd get their money back from that title insurance.
Absolutely. And I just hope that Gail and Jessica can win this fight and get what is theirs that was their father's.
Definitely. If we have any kind of update, Heather, on after the court date, I know I would be interested to know how this comes out.
Definitely. We will keep everyone updated on the outcome, and I have asked Betty Belcher to keep me updated so that we could produce that information to our listeners as everything else transpires. As mentioned earlier, investigators do believe that there could be many more victims out there of Cynthia Wilkinson's. If you know of anyone who had been in contact with Wilkinson at any point and you fear they may be missing, I strongly encourage you to contact your local law enforcement. Names have not been released of any other potential victims of Wilkinson's, as they are part of an ongoing and open investigation. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Gone in a Blink. If you would like to help the family of Mike Brock to regain what his daughters are fighting so hard to get back, his daughters have set up a GoFundMe page to help with attorney fees and all the costs that the family is having to endure in order to obtain what is rightfully theirs. And I will post that link on our Facebook page. I can't thank Betty Belcher enough for talking with me and getting Mike's story out there. Their family has been through so much, and they are continuing to go through so much, and my heart just really, really breaks for them.
If you like our show, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And if you haven't already, please follow us on any of our social media sites. You can find us on Facebook at Gone in a Blink or Instagram at Gone in a Blink Pod. And if you'd like to see us do an episode on a specific case, you can email us at goneinablinkpod@gmail.com. And as always, be safe, be smart, and try not to blink.